Offering our blessing over the Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu לעסוק בדברי תורה, לעסוק בדברי תורה, הפוך בה, לעסוק בדברי תורה, ידעי די 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 די, ידעי די 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 די, ידעי די 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 די, ידעי די די די. Okay. So this week we are going to be concluding the book of Exodus already, right? As we will start to get ready for Leviticus. This week's Torah portion, I was very inclusive in our Haftarah portion for this week. So the way this Haftarah works, it happens to be a double Torah portion this week. So it's Vayachel and also Pekudei. Usually, if the Haftarah is Vayachel, it's the first 10 verses of what we will study today. If it's the Torah portion Pekudei or Vayachel-Pekudei, it's the last section of it. In order to give us some context, I included it all. So the Haftarah is a little bit longer, but I think it's helpful just to understand some of the context of what's going on. And you'll notice that. So, whoops. Can everyone see this okay?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. So we're in the Book of Kings, and we are talking about the creation of the tabernacle, essentially. Our Torah portion, as you might know, is also talking about the creation of the Mishkan, of the holy space. So whereas the Torah portion is talking about kind of a portable holy space in which God can dwell, the Book of Kings is talking about the creation of the temple in Jerusalem, like what we think of when we go to the Western Wall and so on, right? So these things obviously overlap in a lot of ways, and this portion is chosen very purposefully in conjunction with our Torah portion. Any questions about any of that before we dive in?
Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah.
So this is the first temple, and it was destroyed,
Yes.
and another one was built, and it was destroyed. So were the second and third temples that were built, did they use these instructions to rebuild them? Because they're so detailed, and were they rebuilt in the same manner?
Okay, so there hasn't been a third temple, right? The one in the Torah portion is the tabernacle. It wasn't the temple. That's its own totally separate thing. Although it definitely has similarities with the temple being built in Solomon's time, right? The second temple, I do not know if there were differences between the first and the second temple and how it was constructed. Surely the overall design was pretty much the same, but there might have been differences between the two. That's a really interesting question. I've never looked into that. Yeah, I encourage anyone who wants to do some research to look into that, to do that and to bring it back here. It's a great question.
Where would you begin to look for a thing like that?
That is also a great question. I'm not sure I know the answer to that one either. Certainly there are specific historians like Jacob Neusner who writes so many things based on history that maybe there's something that he has put out there that speaks to that. I don't know. I'm not sure. I can put it out and see if people are aware of the answer to that question. I just don't know. I've never been asked that before, and I never thought of it on my own, but it is a wonderful question, Jessica. So thank you.
I got a quick one on the same line.
Yeah.
It was a massive undertaking. where did the resources come from? Who did it and how? And we have more information about the pyramids than we do about the temple.
So, Irv, that is a phenomenal question. That is a great segue into learning the text itself, because that really is so much of what this text is about. And you will still have many questions, perhaps even more questions than you do at this moment about that after reading it. But it is talking to that. So why don't we dive in? Okay. Does anyone want to read this very first verse at the top here?
I can.
Thanks, Irv.
When all the work that King Solomon had done in the house of the Lord was completed, Solomon brought in the sacred the donations of his father David, the silver, the gold, and the vessels, and deposited them in the treasury of the house of the Lord. So they did have a lot. They did have a lot.
Yeah. I mean, David was king. He had a lot of wealth, certainly. There's more questions to be had there, and we're going to go into some of that in a second as well. Solomon is his son who will take over and become king. And it is not King David who builds the temple, which is kind of interesting, and we'll get into that a little bit later too. It is King Solomon. There is this commentary I came across, Rashi, on this verse, who was talking about kind of where some of these materials might have come from and where they didn't come from. So he says, the sacred of his father, here it says Dovid, could also be David, that which remained of the silver and gold dedicated by his father. But the Midrash explains that Shlomo, and Shlomo is Solomon, that Shlomo did not wish to use any of those dedicated materials for the construction of the Beit HaMikdash, which is the temple. And I heard from Torah scholars of Israel who said, because David knew eventually it would be destroyed, so that the idol-worshiping nations would not say that their idols are mightier, for they took their revenge upon the temple, which was built of the plunder and destruction which David plundered from them. And others say that Shlomo said that there was a famine in the days of his father for 3 consecutive years, and he should have squandered these dedicated materials to sustain Israel's poor. So why does Rashi say all of this? What is like the messaging here from everything in this text?
It looks like justification for building it or trying to figure out justification. Also reverse why they shouldn't have built it. Or use those funds anyway. Starting off with controversy.
Yeah, I mean, there definitely is a little bit of a struggle here. Jessica, go ahead.
Well, it says that these are reasons why Shlomo did not wish to use any of these materials, and 2 reasons are given. So that apparently in the future, when it falls, that those who the idol worshiping nations will take all their gold back, because that's where it came from, and make whoopee with it, I guess. And the second one is that it should have been used to feed the poor during famine years. It should have been used for good things.
Part of that makes sense, but they would have taken the gold and silver anyway if they were marauders and come to desecrate the temple.
Yeah, I mean, it also, the piece of that of desecrating the temple was that it wasn't just that the temple was like stripped of its gold. It's that the temple was actually transformed into a temple to worship idols or to worship other gods. And so the idea of putting your wealth into something that would actually be actively part of idol worship, that was the struggle there. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, so even from the very beginning, there is this little bit of grappling with, should these materials be used to create this temple? So what do you think? Because I feel like this is actually a debate that comes up in lots of ways for communities even today, right? Why is it important? Why do they make it a priority to build a temple when gold could have been used for different purposes, to feed people who are struggling, for example? Why do we spend money on maintaining our temple when we could donate all that money to make sure people in our community are taken care of?
Well, what comes to mind for me is the greater good. We're going through that with our Federal Reserve at the moment. The big argument on the news. So with all the steps you're taking, talking to the president of the Fed, you're costing a couple of million people their jobs. And his retort was, yes, there's pain, but there are so many, many more people who benefit by the reduction in inflation. So it's a similar argument. For the greater good, it sounds like to me with this discussion. Yeah, we could use the money to take care of the poor of Israel, but what we're doing has more impact on the future of Israel.
Okay, great. Yeah, Cornelia, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to add something. So we haven't really talked about the reason given about worshiping idols, as opposed to the what competition between countries or peoples that worship idols and people that worship Yahweh. And I just want to say that this is a really important competition, a really important issue that comes up again and again. And it might be interesting to talk a little more about what that means to worship an idol, and by contrast, what it means to worship the Israelite God. What's the difference? So I just want to raise that, because I don't think we should use a term like worshiping idols without thinking more about what it really means.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's come up in a lot of ways within text, right? Like last week when we were studying the text of, this competition, right, between the Baalim and Asherah versus worshiping God, idol worship. Like, for example, when the temple was destroyed, we know the Hanukkah story. What did they do? They turned the temple into a place to worship Zeus. Now that's idol worship because it's worshiping a God that is outside of our own. And the rabbis of this time, especially, would have would be rolling over in their graves thinking of that. Like, this is something that they created for God, and now it's being used to worship other gods that aren't the real God. That's problematic to them. Yeah, Jessica, go ahead.
Well, I think, Cornelia, to address your issue, like what's the difference? I think a major difference is the idols were invested with power themselves. The way I understand it, that when you worshipped an idol, you worshipped an object that was powerful, as opposed to when we pray to God. God isn't there. We don't have God's power invested in some object.
That's interesting.
So I think that's one big difference.
Quickly, I think it's also comes to my mind when you talk about worshiping idols, polytheism versus monotheism. Because most idol worshippers had more than one. They had multiple gods. Romans had them all lined up for every part of their lives. So did the Greeks. So it's what we have always been monotheistic. One God, a jealous God, but don't want any other gods.
Right. I think it's important to kind of put this in the context of what it is here. It's not necessarily about a polemic against idol worship, although that's certainly existed. This is about longevity. This is, here's all the wealth of our nation. Maybe we shouldn't be putting it in something that will be used against us in the future. Like that's kind of the underpinning idea that Rashi has here. And remember, Rashi is writing in the Middle Ages at a time that a lot of Jewish things have been destroyed and continue to be destroyed. So that mindset needs to be brought in. Like that really is what he's talking about here. This other piece as well, right? This idea that there's famine, maybe the money should just be put to that. What is it about creating a temple that, despite these objections that are brought up in this Rashi text, the temple is going to be created by Shlomo, by Solomon? So why is that ultimate decision made when these arguments are out there? What's important about a temple? Yeah, Rabbi Catherine.
Well, a temple is, we would not have a picture or a thing that represented what God looks like what a bull looks like, or what an animal looks like. We don't do it that way. So, and a lot of what the quote pagan or other people do in other religions is there are pictures, there are things that made that are supposed to look like whatever the god or the saint or whatever it is. So from that point of view, it would be incorrect to put something there that we would say stands for God, but that isn't, again, that is not what you read in it. I don't know. It's like somehow also is that your synagogue, your temple, your whatever it is supposed to be sturdy enough to take care, is usually built to be sturdy enough to impress people when they walk in, that it's well kept, that it's well done, and also to make people feel comfortable that there is some way of prompting the way that you want to feel when you're about to start the service and it starts really clicking in for you. You know, a part of that is how the synagogue, the temple, the whatever it is built and beautified and cared for.
Beautiful. So well said. Yeah, Jessica and then Misty. Oh, you're muted though, Jessica. We can't hear you.
To carry on Rabbi Catherine's theme, I think we have a temple because we need to come together to worship, so that we're all sort of on the same page, you know, the same scroll. And we need to come together to hear the Torah read. And we need to come together so we can discuss it and argue it. And so, as you know, Rabbi Catherine pointed, it's a community place for us to come to do these things. That's why I think we need a temple.
Beautiful. Thank you. Yeah, Misty.
So my thought on this is that up to now, they've had the tabernacle. So they do have a place to come to worship, right? Or to at least reverence God. But when you build the temple, you're building this beautiful building in thanksgiving to the God who gave you the promised land, who brought you through and gave you the promised land. And here you have Jerusalem, which is going to be the holy city. So you want to give reverence and dedicate something to give back to God who's given you so much. So yes, it's a gathering place, but it's also symbolic of everything that God has done for Israel. And something that they can give back, a visual gift back to God, and a reminder to all the people of why there is the temple. And you know, here we have the promised land and this beautiful city, and who gets all of the praise and thanks? It should be God. Anyway.
Beautiful. Yeah. And what you bring up, Misty, also is a really important distinction between the tabernacle and the temple. The tabernacle, it is, as you said, absolutely this sacred holy space that they had. The temple is permanent, whereas the tabernacle was constantly taken apart and rebuilt and moved. And so it had this impermanence to it. Now this temple being built, it's like the community is finally settled within a land for the very first time. That's a big, big deal. So what I've heard in these comments is that the temple actually is really important. Yes, it's important to take care of people who are in need. Absolutely. It is also important to have a central place where community can gather together, to have something that inspires us as a community to do the work that our tradition tells us to do, and that uplifts us and brings us to this place of gratitude that here we are. All really beautiful ideas that definitely are encapsulated in what is happening. And so as we go on with this text, we're going to see ways in which people come together in order to create this space, because just like all of you, there is this recognition that, yeah, it's important. It's really, really important. So would anyone would like to continue reading the next verse?
I can read.
Thank you, Misty.
Then Solomon convoked the elders of Israel, all the heads of the tribes and the ancestral chieftains of the Israelites, before King Solomon in Jerusalem, to bring up the ark of the covenant of the Lord from the city of David, that is Zion. Hiram also made the lavers, the scrapers, and the sprinkling bowls. So Hiram finished all the work that he had been doing for King Solomon on the house of the Lord.
Okay, so that text from 740 is actually a little bit earlier. That's not within this Haftarah, but it gives us a little bit of context that I think is actually super important with our Torah portion and Haftarah. Okay, so what do we notice about this text? If we look at it really quickly, right? It's bringing different people in. It's bringing in the elders of Israel, the heads of tribes, the ancestral chieftains, all a part of this process to bring the Ark of the Covenant to have a central place within the temple. And the Ark of the Covenant, that is where the Ten Commandments are stored, right? That's a big deal. That's the central holy spot of all of it. He also, as we see in it, like the verses before, there is someone named Hiram who is charged by doing some very particular work in beautifying this space.
It's almost like he's finished off a work of Bezalel.
Well, that's exactly it. So I put in a verse from this week's Torah portion where we talk of Bezalel. So same kind of thought there, Rabbi Catherine. Thank you. Bezalel, does everyone know who Bezalel was? So basically, he's an artisan who's called by God to create the tabernacle and to beautify this tabernacle in so many different ways. Sharon, yeah, did you have a question or a comment? Oh, you're muted. We can't hear you yet.
Can you explain sprinkling bowls?
Sprinkling bowls? Oh, it's a little gross. I mean, we're talking about animal sacrifice. We're talking about animal sacrifice. That's what's going on here.
Oh, okay. So it's blood. Okay.
We don't do this today. That's a good thing, right? But it definitely was a part of our experience, our worship experience for a long time as a people.
Okay.
Yeah. I was just kind of, going past that.
Thank you.
Good question though, Sharon. So let's look at this. So, and Moses said to the Israelites, see, Adonai has singled out by name Bezalel, son of Uri, son of Hur, of the tribe of Judah, endowing him with a divine spirit of skill, ability, and knowledge in every kind of craft. So God gave him the ability to do everything, to oversee all of the artistry of the tabernacle. That's from this week's Torah portion. And it really is a beautiful parallel with this piece about Hiram right here, who isn't given the exact kind of divine skill that Bezalel is. Bezalel has an overarching skill set that God gifted to him. It's a little different and more specified with Hiram, but no less important. So there is a text from the JPS Biblical Commentary on Haftarot, where Michael Fishbane talks a little bit of this connection. Would anyone like to read this text?
Sure.
Thank you, Rabbi Catherine.
Just as Solomon utilized resources of one Hiram, the king, to have wood transported from Lebanon and to have the hewn stones shaped by his masons for the temple's foundation. He utilized the skills of another, the coppersmith, for the design and casting of the various features of the temple. This was practical politics. One Hiram had the resources, the other the skill. And Solomon had the wisdom to utilize foreign achievements in the crude and final arts, porterage, getting this stuff get there.
Yeah.
Masonry, metalwork, and design for his own religious purposes. Huh. So that Solomon had religious purchases that were possibly not those that have been carried forward.
So basically, what is he doing? He's realizing this is not a one-man show. It is not Solomon's temple, right? I mean, this is pretty obvious, but it also is really, really important, right? This is not Solomon's temple. It is not all him as king. What does he do? He sees resources, he sees skills, he sees opportunities for others to be invested in creating this temple. And with wisdom, he invites them to use those skills and to bring in their gifts in order to create it. So it becomes this partnership of working together.
I keep
Cornelia.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I keep remembering how long ago it was that we crossed the Jordan. How long ago it is that we have been here having a community, a force of our own, and we've been carrying around these things all of this time. But we've had very, very different experiences. We're not slaves just released now. We are a very different population in some ways. A lot of ways.
Yeah, it's been a lot of growth since those days. Exactly.
Yeah, so this now finalizing the temple brings us back to where we came from in some ways.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, Cornelia, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I want to chew on the same bone of the difference between idols.
Sorry about that.
Only the first time of a difference between worshiping an idol and worshiping the Jewish God, whatever that is, the Yahweh, Elohim. And I still want to think of it in terms of the difference being with the idol, there's more a one-way sort of, someone said, turning to the idol because the idol has power. Whereas with the Jews and the Jewish God, or the Israelites and the Israelite God, there's a conversation, there's a dialogue, one side influences the other. For example, there's a gradual change in the Israelite people over time. There's a covenant. There's emphasis on community with this whole building of the tabernacle. One person's skills isn't enough. You need complementary skills. And also a point that Plout makes is that this whole, the long discussion of just how the tabernacle was put together emphasizes on the part of the people and obedience to God. So it's a theme of relationship that comes up. And I'm suggesting that's one of the key differences between idol worship and Yahweh worship. Is the relationship or the lack thereof.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so much of when we talk about God, it's covenantal. We see that with the prophets time and time again, right? It's the voice of God that's coming out. God is effectual. God does things within the Torah and within the books of prophets, but it's in relationship with the Jewish people.
Right.
And we accept Jew, when you think about it, and all the things that other people were doing, is we accepted God that we cannot see and will never see.
Mm-hmm. That's true. Yeah.
Even if we sometimes anthropomorphize God, right?
Well, we do
still
that
have
a
that
lot.
acknowledgement. Yeah, certainly, because it makes it easier to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to also just bring in Midrashim about Betzalel. So this is really going to the Torah portion for just a second based on the verses that we just looked at, okay? Observe what he did for Betzalel. The Holy One, blessed be he. This is very midrashim kind of language. Instilled the wisdom in his heart, as it is said, and he hath filled him with the Spirit of God in wisdom and understanding and in knowledge. It was with these attributes the Holy One, blessed be he, created his world. As it is said, the Lord by wisdom founded the earth, by understanding he established the heavens, by knowledge the depths were broken up. With the same attributes, Betzalel erected the tabernacle. So God gave these gifts so that Betzalel could erect the tabernacle. When we look at our Haftarah portion, and this is what's happening, is it's comparing the two, right? The temple was similarly constructed by means of these three attributes, the same ones. As it is said, he was the son of a widow of the tribe of Naphtali, and his father was a man of Tyre, and he was filled with wisdom, understanding, and skill. That's that important part. Similarly, the temple will be rebuilt in the future with these three attributes. As it is said, through wisdom is a house built, and by understanding it is established. And by knowledge are the chambers filled with all precious and pleasant riches. Therefore, and he hath filled them with the Spirit of God. So I know this is a little bit hard to follow. This is the kind of structure that Tanhuma always works in, and kind of is going back to the same ideas, but using lots of different verses of text in which to do so and weaving them together. But it's pointing to these three very important attributes: wisdom, understanding, and skill.
It sounds like God prepared these individuals with these skills that had a calling to do this duty. I mean, they arose to the project, or they arose to the idea, to the overall plan. Each bringing their strengths with them.
Yeah. And you know what? No one person has all three of these things all of the time. So it again is that message of we have to be in this together to do this right.
Right. Even a genius like Einstein would sometimes forget to put all his clothes on.
I don't know if that's true or not, but it's a good comment nonetheless. All right, let's keep going with the text. I don't know how much of it we will get through, but we will do our best because we're still in the part that isn't actually this week's Haftarah. We're still in the early verses. Okay, I'm just going to read this quickly because it has lots of names. All the men of Israel gathered before King Solomon at the feast, and the month of Ethanim, that is the 7th month, when all the elders of Israel had come, the priests lifted the ark and carried up the ark of the Eternal. Then the priests and the Levites brought the tent of meeting and all of the holy vessels that were in the tent. Meanwhile, King Solomon and the whole community of Israel, who were assembled before him with the ark, were sacrificing sheep and oxen in such abundance that they could not be numbered or counted. I know when we read this, we might be grossed out, but the idea here is they were approaching with such gratitude.
Right.
They wanted to give of themselves fully and completely to God. And that's something that it's pretty powerful to have that kind of a reaction, right? Think of like the drives that we have in temple. Right now, we have a drive going on in temple where Ethan, for his bar mitzvah, is collecting all sorts of things. They are getting so much stuff, they don't even know where to put it. That's the kind of thing that's going on here. It's like this huge response, and it's heartwarming and beautiful and full of the best possible qualities. Let's go a little further down. So the priests brought the Ark of the Lord's covenant into its place underneath the wings of the cherubim. So if we remember earlier, we had spoken about cherubim in a different context. These are the angelic kind of beings that were on the kind of like the Ark of the Covenant. They had their wings spread out over the place of the ark so that the cherubim shielded the ark and its poles from above. The poles projected so that the end of the poles were visible in the sanctuary in front of the shrine, but they could not be seen outside. And there they remain to this day. There was nothing inside the ark but the 2 tablets of stone, which Moses placed there at Horeb. when the Eternal made a covenant with the Israelites after the departure from the land of Egypt. And we'll see this little context, this little commentary from Rashi, that the cherubim described here are not the exact same ones in the tabernacle, that they are a little different from one another. We're not going to totally get into all of that. That's an important thing just to keep in mind, that it's not exactly the same. And maybe that speaks a little bit to Jessica's question from earlier. Any comments on any of this before we keep going?
It's just amazing that this is being done. I keep going back to how long it's been and for how long we have transported and cared for and polished, and all of that is really quite amazing.
Mm-hmm. And there's intricacy, right? We're not going into the details of all of that intricacy, but we can see that there's a lot of intentionality and there's a lot of details involved in this creation.
And to me, yeah, of course you'd be slaughtering a lot of animals because you would be having an enormous meal for an enormous number of people.
That's true. And to God, yeah.
Yeah, well, in his honor, should we say.
Mm-hmm.
It's only one time that God and man had lunch together, as it were.
All right. So when the priest came out of the sanctuary, for the cloud had filled the house of the Eternal, and this was this idea of God's dwelling, God's presence being signified by a cloud. The priests were not able to remain and perform the service because of the cloud, for the presence of the Eternal filled the house of the Eternal. God's presence was so potent within this space that the priest couldn't actually do the service to God because God's presence was so present. Such an interesting idea, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Rashi's comment is, after the Kohanim, the priest, went out of the Kodesh, this holy space. As the Kohanim who carried the ark into the Holy of Holies were leaving, the divine presence immediately came to rest in the sanctuary. So right after the tabernacle, the tablets were deposited, then God's presence became so incredibly potent. Yeah, go ahead.
Just a funny thought came from you. Were talking about the cloud. It could have been the smoke from that big barbecue that was going on.
Maybe. That's funny. I didn't think of that, but very fair point.
Just a comic of me, trying to make a little humor on a bright day.
What was that again? I blinked and I liked laughing.
I said the cloud might have been the smoke from the giant barbecue that was going on outside.
It's a fair point. I mean, you're not wrong. I included this verse from Psalms just because it speaks to the beauty of the temple. I think this is such gorgeous poetry, the way this is written. One thing I ask of God, only that do I seek, to live in the house of the Eternal all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of God, to frequent God's temple. Kind of speaks to the profundity and the beauty of this space that they invested so much in, right? That maybe we feel a small part of when we go to our own temples. Let's continue a little bit more. We're not getting through this whole text, that's for sure, but there are a couple things that I really do want to make sure we get to. Would anyone like to read these verses? Yeah, Jessica, please.
Then Solomon declared, "The Lord has chosen to abide in a thick cloud. I have now built for you a stately house, a place where you may dwell forever."
Which is also very poetic in a similar way to that psalm, isn't it?
Then, should I go on?
Yeah, please.
Then, with the whole congregation of Israel standing, the king faced about and blessed the whole congregation of Israel. He said, "Praise be the Lord, the God of Israel, who has fulfilled with deeds the promise he made to my father David. For he said, ever since I brought my people Israel out of Egypt, I have not chosen a city among all the tribes of Israel for building a house where my name might abide. But I have chosen David to rule my people Israel. Now my father David had intended to build a house for the name of the Lord, the God of Israel. But the Lord said to my father David, as regards your intention to build a house for my name, you did right to have that intention. However, you shall not build the house yourself. Instead, your son, the issue of your loins, shall build the house for my name. And the Lord has fulfilled the promise that he made. I have succeeded my father David, and have ascended the throne of Israel as the Lord promised. I have built the house for the name of the Lord, the God of Israel, and I have set a place there for the ark, containing the covenant which the Lord made with our fathers when he brought them out from the land of Egypt."
Thank you so much for reading all of that, Jessica. And we can see this kind of explanation. People might ask the question, David was such a great king. Why didn't he build the temple? Why is it Solomon, right? And this is answering that question, saying, well, God said it was meant to be me, the issue of his loins. So why is that? Why do you think it was Solomon?
It's kind of a sidebar thing. When I decided one day that I was going to read about David, I thought, this would be kind of a short read. And he was a good guy, and he was the one who sang, and he killed that. And it goes on and on and on. And he was not such a great guy for a significant amount of time.
David is a complicated figure. There is no doubt about that.
I was
Yeah,
shocked. I said I would never have named my son David if I'd known the whole story.
Yeah, Jessica, go ahead.
Well, I don't know if this is a valid comment, but it seems to me this is like a little bit like when Moses was not allowed to go to the promised land. And now we have David, who's done so much, is not allowed to build the temple. I don't know if that's the same kind of thing. It's like the firstborn isn't allowed. It's the second.
Yeah, I mean, why do you think that is?
I have no idea.
I think that I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
I think that King David had done so much and achieved so much that he had to leave some achieving for his son to do, to give goals, to have something to work towards and build on. So I think he kind of left that, or God let him leave it, so that his son will have something to try and achieve and build towards. That's what I always took out of that.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you, Frank. Yeah, Misty, go ahead.
So one group of thought that I've read about is that David had a lot of blood on his hand. And this is at the beginning of Solomon's reign, where the temple is getting built, before the 1,000 women in his lives and, the different track that he went down. I think some of it has to do with purity and righteousness issues. I mean, there's no doubt that David was a man for God's heart, when you read the Psalms and everything else, but he had a lot of missteps in his life, which wouldn't necessarily bode well for building this holy place of reverence, right? Is that really who you want to build this symbol, this gathering place for God's people? So
Yeah, right. And that's also kind of what Rabbi Catherine was alluding to as well. I think there's something, I think that Jessica, like the metaphor to Moses not entering the promised land is really an interesting one in this context as well, because it teaches us something, right? I'm thinking of Hamilton right now, where George Washington decides not to be president and is like, I got to teach them how to say goodbye, right? That maybe there is this lesson that it's not about us, right? We're serving a greater purpose. If David did all of these things, maybe it would be thought that it was all about David. And it's not all about David. It's about the community as a whole and the legacy that continues for generations. Yeah, Sharon, go ahead.
Yes, so you were touching on what I wanted to say. It's about continuity. You want to get the next generation and hopefully the next generation. You don't want it to stop at that first generation.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so powerful. It's about community, but not just the community that's present at this moment, the community and as it continues over the course of the millennia.
Right.
We actually have done pretty well to get through the text. I did not think we necessarily would be able to do that. And look at us, look how well we've done. There is a poem that I really want to bring in here. I don't know how many of you are connected with Marge Percy, if you've read some of her poetry. If you haven't, I strongly encourage you to look her up. She writes absolutely beautiful pieces. And this is one of my favorites of her. And it reminds me of this Torah portion. And I think as you read this portion, you'll understand. But not only that, it doesn't just remind me of this Torah and Haftarah portion. I had mentioned that there is a new Haftarah commentary that recently came out. And this piece happened to be flagged as a alternative Haftarah for this particular week. When it showed up in there as well, I decided that it had to be a part of our Haftarah Torah study today. So I'm just going to read this poem. To be of use. The people I love best jump into the work head first, without dallying in the shadows, and swim off with sure strokes almost out of sight. They seem to become natives of that element, the black sleek heads of seals bouncing like half-submerged balls. I love people who harness themselves an ox to a heavy cart, who pull like water buffalo with massive patience, who strain in the mud and muck to move things forward, who do what has to be done again and again. I want to be with people who submerge in the task, who go into the field to harvest and work in a row and pass the bags along, who are not parlor generals and field deserters, but move in a common rhythm when the food must come in or the fire be put out. The work of the world is common as mud. Botched, it smears the hands, crumbles to dust. But the thing worth doing well done has shape that satisfies, clean and evident. Greek amorphous for wine or oil, Hopi vases that held corn are put in museums. But you know they were made to be used. The pitcher cries for water to carry, and the person for work that is real. Beautiful piece of poetry, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes.
And I think you can probably see why it relates so much to our Torah and Haftarah portion. Right? I'm just going to bring in this commentary that talks to this, and then I'm going to close this down so we can just talk with one another. Okay. So this is the name of the new Haftarah commentary that recently came out. It's called Prophetic Voices, Renewing and Reimagining Haftarah. And it includes a bunch of different alternative texts and also a little bit of commentary on the traditional text. It's a pretty neat book. It just came out a month ago. So in it, Danielle Kraniak said, Vayachel's discussion of the construction of the Mishkan is paralleled in its Haftarah reading, which focuses on the construction of the temple with its heavy beyond measure bronze implements and decorations, and its olden ornaments and component pieces. With no temple and no temple service, how do we understand the physicality of these ritual objects transformed along with the service of the heart? Perhaps the work of the world, in the words of Percy, infused with the holiness of a shared vision and commitment to the actions that sustain our people and our human lives on a daily basis, can take the place of that bronze and gold. Perhaps we who jump into the work head first have taken the place of the artisan, Hiram, and King Solomon. So what are your thoughts on this? What kind of reflections? Do you agree with that commentary? Are there other questions or thoughts as you're processing all of it? Yeah, Sharon, go ahead.
I think we've got to have a place. We can't do this in abstraction. We have to have a place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. That place remains really, really important. We all physically coming to temple, right? We could every single week just be on Zoom if that's what we wanted to do. But we understand how important it is to actually be physically present whenever we are well enough to be able to do so, right? Any other thoughts on that?
Could you put the quotes
The
up
last
again,
text?
please?
Yeah, sure. Let me
Thank
get
you.
that back up. Is this what you wanted?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. So Sharon, you're saying the work or the place can't be replaced just by work that we do. Yeah, Jessica.
I was struck by the parts of the poem that talks about working together with other people. Could you scroll up to that section maybe? Here, where I want to be with people who submerge in the task. That really struck deeply to me. People working together in a row, passing the bags along, or putting out the fire, or bringing in the food. The common rhythm. I think that's really beautiful. That
Yeah, it's a beautiful metaphor.
I like the thing of to do what has to be done again and again. You know, and to me, it assumes that you want to work with the other people. It doesn't matter who's the boss. It's like, where would you like this chair to be?
And these are free people. These aren't slaves.
No,
the slaves don't work like this. These are free people who go of their own will, free will.
Not building for themselves, but for the future generation.
They are. Yeah, Misty, I see your hand. Go ahead.
Yeah. So, I've been very fortunate to be able to go to Israel twice. And one of the things that strikes me when I visit Jerusalem is, they have a museum there because there's a movement to build that third temple, the need for a temple. And these people have come together and built these objects based on what it tells us in the Torah in terms of how the menorah looked and how the laves looked and all the stuff, right? And then what the high priest wore, and it's you look at this and it's incredible and it's awe-inspiring and it's like, wow. And then you imagine it in the place because everything is massive, it's bigger than life. Some of the things that they have built based on that. So this desire to and they came together to build this, and they have this hope moving forward that someday there will be a third temple. I don't know if I can wrap my head around the sacrifices, but the fact that there's this need for community. And I think that's what you hear over and over again, this sense of, this is our identity. This is who we are. This is what makes us who we are.
Yeah. I think that you point out something in talking about the third temple too, that might kind of be like the underlying context of what is being talked about here too, because as Reformed Jews, we don't actually want there to be a third temple. That would be highly problematic. One, because we don't want to go back 2,000 years as if nothing has happened since then. And also because where would the third temple be? And what would that do to Muslim sites and relationships with other people, right? That's problematic at best. So are there ways for us to gather and have holy spaces and also to perhaps replace this creating with bronze and gold, creating a temple with the way in which we sustain our people and our human lives on a daily basis, with the way in which we work together to create good?
Well, wouldn't that be the synagogue of today?
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, you know, in the newsletters it tells, you know, I mean, even in the coming weeks, you're having a community Seder. I mean, this constant reaching out and gathering of people. And so the media that we use today is the internet and social media, right? Again, this, you know, reaching out to our brothers and sisters and bringing them this call to come together.
Yeah, we all have temples with little t's, these little temples all over the world. And there we have that inspiration. We have these gathering places. We have the opportunities for gratitude. And we also have the calling to do the important work of gathering people and serving the greater community, both today and building the foundation for future.
And it also puts you in a place where people want to be there, which avoids a lot of strife. And when strife does come up, and it does from time to time, your reference point is that ability, that desire to work with other people. Well, maybe, you know, you and I aren't getting along very well today, and we just need to say, hey, okay, or we're going to stay at different corners of the room and do whatever needs to be done. And when we feel better, come back like the human beings we should be. You know, but there are a lot of ways to do it. It makes that competition thing is removed.
Yeah, because you have that same kind of central point. That's what it's all about.
Let's
Awesome.
have a closing comment for me.
Please.
One of the things I remember from my yeshiva days was the Book of Kings. We didn't get into the Haftarah, and I was skeptical about this course taking on this subject. I had another preference, as you might know, but Tom. But this week has been a really, really good one. Appreciate it, and all the commentary from everybody.
Thank you all. Yeah, this is a wonderful discussion and a really interesting Haftarah it is.
Yeah.
Next week, we'll join together for another one. Again, just a reminder, the week after that, if someone would like to step up to lead the last week of March, you're welcome to do so. I will be out of town, so that's why it's canceled then. And on the first day of Passover, we will also not be having Torah study that day. So just mark that down. I do have emails all scheduled to go out to remind you of all of those things. Okay, good. I look forward to seeing you all soon. Thanks again.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.